But one is what's possible if you wait for your wet forms to dry to the middle stage of dryness that we call leather hard. And if you've worked in clay before, you're very familiar with this. The clay, after manipulating it wet, almost always needs you to stop touching it, okay? Because to touch it further is to go beyond its capacity to hold a thinner wall, a bigger structure, while the clay is wet. The drier clay is a foundation that you can add wet clay to and keep going with the structure of the drier clay. Or you can remove material more easily and have the form hold its shape without collapsing. So leather hard is a really important stage for almost all ceramic projects, even though we all just have in our mind Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore, right? And all that delicious plasticity and wetness, okay? And we just can't get over that. And a lot of people really just think it's all about the wet stuff, okay? But it's really not. So today, I want to go through some ideas for you. You have your own little parts that are drier, and we'll talk about what you might do with them as a way to explore this very important stage. So let me just get in here. First of all, just to underscore, if you want to make changes to a form in ceramics, you need to have moisture. So the parts, whether it's wetter clay you're adding to drier clay or two drier pieces, there has to be some moisture in all of it to marry. Because dry clay temporarily stops shrinking. Wet clay that you're trying to add is shrinking and it'll always crack away. It doesn't have a chance to shrink together and stay married together. So this is why this plastic becomes vital, is to keep it from getting too dry while you're still making changes. Leather hard is actually many subtle layers in and of itself. This one, for instance, is what I would call butter. And butter it's got that structure, it's got more structure, but it also allows for me to stretch it. Now this, you can see the lack of plasticity showing up in this cracking. But I can go into the wall of this thicker thing and make a form that's more controlled within the form. And this will allow it to hold there. So you might want to explore if you have some more stretching to do in this dryer. This one is a true medium leather hard. If I were to push into this, it would just crack. Okay, there's no plasticity left. So this is cutting and pasting. Okay, you'll have to make cuts and reattach them. So before we start talking about some of those structures, more complicated structures one could make, I want to talk about your tools a little bit, because I know many of you are new to this and new to your tools as well. So one wonderful opportunity with leather hard clay is the idea of reduction. And these metal loop tools are designed to remove material when it's drier, usually. You may have these two types if you bought a tool kit. They come in every shape and size on the marketplace. But you can experiment. Of course, the metal is a strip. The edge goes perpendicular where you want to remove. Put pressure in and back. This broad one allows me to take a shallower cut. As long as there's moisture in the object, which we know there will be, it will leave tool marks. So there's a way, if your goal is to make something you handled when it was wet, have no evidence of your hand, you want it to look mechanical, then you would go through a series of removals at slightly different drynesses to take away information over drying. Okay? And some of my other, like my Ceramics 1 class, there's a project where they bring in a commercial cup, ceramic cup, we call it their favorite cup, and then they have to make a trompe l'oeil version of that cup. And the project is not very creative, but it allows for you to see what it takes to remove plasticity. You know, to remove all that information is quite a lot you have to go through. Okay, so like that. So you can do that. These, of course, are really nice for a thicker wall in terms of more like a relief that I could carve into the wall of my hollow form. So I could have this really amazing textured, could hold imagery, carved imagery, pattern. For instance, I could make this look like a mosaic by leaving these raised tiles. And then later, I could even color this form and carve through the color. We call that sgraffito. And then fire on that color, and then later with glaze, I could fill these trenches with what would become glaze and have a glassy recessed line and a raised drier color on the top. So you learn, with all these stages we'll be exploring, you're going to start to learn how to anticipate something that you want to do in a later stage, right? And that's really where this is heading, so that it feels that integration. Okay, so you'll practice with your tools. Other things, another tip, very often people that are newer want to make something smooth, and they think, oh, I'll use water. Now, that's not a terrible instinct. It's only just not very effective when there's moisture in the form. It will resist making a change with water, but it won't resist compression. So I could take something like this flexible rib, and I'm literally, it's pretty soft, so it's making a change that way, but it's compressing those particles, those flat particles under the microscope, into, they're pushed together, and it brings up almost like a skin-like seal to the form. So, before when water is very effective, is on bone-dry clay, then it almost melts it. It just will dissolve it. Hence that project. I think, who was showing that project? I think one of your inspirations, the unfired vessels that were filled with water, they just dissolved like cartoon animation in acetone, right? They just dissolved. Okay. So what I want to talk about, and this will be something that you're going to use probably for the remaining class and maybe even into the week, is cutting and pasting. And so all of these humble little quick shapes, I'm just going to pull a couple out, can become building blocks for very complex forms if you know how to wait until they have the structure to become a part of a bigger whole without collapsing. So let's say I want to start building a bigger sculpture by attaching this to this, okay? So one thing I have to sort out is the transition. And of course the drier clay will hold the cut a little bit differently than if it were wet. This is on the softer side still. And now there's more shared thing. Notice just making a cut in drier clay, the edges that are held versus the drag softness of even a sharp knife in wet clay. So you just want to be really curious about all those subtle differences. It could be that I want to make a really precise connection here, so I might take a tool, needle tool, or even this tool, and make a record of where I want them to be together. So there's a very simple technique that you're going to use time and time again, no matter what you're making, when you're joining two pieces of clay that have a different dryness. It could be wet clay to drier clay, it could be two drier pieces. It's called scoring and slipping. I'm going to score with my serrated edge tool. You can use a needle tool or even a plastic fork from the cafeteria. I'm going to score, which is roughing up the areas where they're going to be joined. What you're doing here is you're breaking the drier skin of the form and revealing the moisture that's trapped in the middle of the wall. Okay, so I'll just score both areas. Slip is an admixture of water and clay. Copious amounts can usually be found in the bucket beside the sink. It's a little creepy how you have to go in there and get it, okay? You may not be that comfortable with it, but there's nothing in there that will harm you, so do not worry. Often I have a stiff brush, but of course, in the best spirit of not being prepared for the cooking show, I'll just use. Oh, that's okay. I'll just use this. It's fine. Thank you so much, though. So, people have different preferences of their slip, as you can imagine. Some people probably use Cuisinart and get it nice and even. Some like chunky salsa, It's all pretty effective, It doesn't really matter that much, but you want the weakened clay particles definitely in what you're adding. So now I'm going to take some of my slip and add it into the scored areas. When there's this much moisture, I don't need as much slip. So I'm just going to do the one side. So then I'm going to find where it needs to go back together. So now I can clean this up with a sponge, of course. But really what I want to do to bring this together in a way that it'll stay together is a couple of things. The slip only goes so far in the transition of connecting them. Another thing to do is to put compression in this seam. This has been through, as crude as this form is, it has gone through a lot of compression so far with the pinching, the tools that I used. Think of those plates going further and further together, strengthening. Same here. This slip clay is very weak, open clay. So what I want to do is use compression, and I could use a tool, something that's maybe rounder. Maybe I'll just do this. It's not a... Because my pieces are on the softer side, I can even bring material down into the seam from one of the pieces. Another thing that I might do is to have some wet clay and make a thin coil and load it in there as a transition, part of the transition of these two parts, and clean that up. You're making something you want to stay physically attached as it continues to shrink and move, but you're of course also thinking of visual transitions that have to be accounted for. That's up to you. Sometimes you want it to look like Frankenstein's monster with all the seams and scars, and sometimes you want it to feel as if these were organically grown together. They are all of one visual. Now I have done something in this simple connecting of these two parts that will cause a problem later. What is it?
There's air trap.
Yes.
What was the answer?
Air. Trapped air. Remember, a trapped pocket of air, when heated to the temperatures of our kiln, could also expand and blow out a section, just like moisture can. All I need to do is have a single pinhole to release it somewhere. Could be in here. If I'm going to continue to build and close this in, I could open up this whole section and remove it and have one big open chamber as I'm adding these other pieces. Okay? So the other thing you're doing when you're building from parts is you're not only building for aesthetics, you're building for stability. So you have to really think about this as you're building, as maintaining its stable balance on a horizontal surface, because not only it's going to, and also this is redistributing as it's shrinking. The thicker areas move in different ways than the thinner areas, so there could be tilting and rebalancing. So I'm always thinking of that as I'm building. Once it's bone dry and it stops moving, we load it in a kiln on a shelf, and it has to be stable as it continues to shrink through firing. So nobody wants their piece to become unstable and like a bowling ball in the kiln for other things that are being fired. Okay, so another idea, so this is a very this is stable somewhat because gravity is holding it down. But what if I want to add an asymmetrical part? Okay, so you remember this lovely pod thing. So what if this needs to go here? Okay, so I know there's going to be an issue there. But another thing I can do before I add it is make this thickness more compatible with this thickness. I'm going to remove material from the inside. What ceramics really wants from you, from an engineering perspective, and to minimize warping and the movement of warping, is if you were to slice your form in any direction, it would be described with one wall thickness all the way through, the same thickness. Doesn't mean you have to, but thicker areas and thinner areas move at different rates and cause more warping. So I'm just going to go in with my fettling knife and I can scoop out. Of course, I could carve the outside as well if I wanted to change it that way. Okay, so another thing to know generally is the horizontal parts of your piece are the ones that go through the most movement. So what I mean by that is, and this is a good thing to say, like if you're working in the metal studio and you want to describe a three-dimensional line with a rod of material in space, you have a solid rod of metal to work with, and we have an understanding that the more solid it is, the stronger it is. In ceramics, it's not that way. Solid, thin rods of material deflect a lot more as they're moving, with gravity and curling and all the things about drawing. If you can open up your linear form with a hollowness, you have the geometry of a cylinder to keep it from moving. So it's actually a hollow form is stronger in that way than a solid form. So I have this little thing that's hollow, which is good. And the more horizontal it is, the more gravity is going to put stress on this and pull it away. If I can establish more of a diagonal line up, I have the geometry of the diagonal line to counter gravity's deflecting and pushing it down as well. So that's just something to know. I'm just going to get this on here really quick. Okay, again, you can see how that went. So, I could counter this with another form and start to play with that kind of balance. This, of course, could be repositioned. There's a reason why Meissen figurines from the 17th century are on a domed piece of landscape. It's not just because of the environment of that, what that represents. It's also the structure of the dome that can hold the weight of the other sculptural components. So, as I would never compare this to a Meissen figurine, obviously. Please don't misinterpret me. So this is tilting this way. Another way to counter it is to cut the bottom so it redistributes the weight. So this is something, a correction I do often. Always have to, So if I start here and I cut, this form is not this. Okay. So I was able to kind of work with the asymmetry by tilting the bottom. Okay, so one last thing to throw out now is the rest of this pod form. When the clay was soft, I really relied on the doming of this to keep it from collapsing. It was all that geometry because the clay was so weak with water. But now that there's dryness, I can deconstruct this and make parts that I can build with that are different types of parts. So I could just cut this into calamari, right? I always make myself so hungry in these shows, my food references. This one is a little bit on the soft side, so it's kind of changing as I'm cutting it, but you'll get the idea. So these little shapes could also now become, I could build another hollow form, like a screen wall, okay? So it might mean, for many of you, and how you were talking about your previous work and how it might play out in your ceramic work this semester, you might need to get to the language part and really take on a playfulness to get there. An experimental playfulness. What if something that you built with a lot of control gets dropped on the floor, stiffened, and then it gets sectioned, and those strips become the building blocks that have all the texture and history in the unit. So, my friend Kathy Butterly, you may know her work. She works in clay, and she's amazing. She said in one of her slide talks one time, you know, in the solving of my ceramic sculptures, sometimes I have to eliminate the thing that I love the most about it to resolve it. The thing that I'm protecting is the thing that has to be given up to move it forward to the finish line. And that is really true, I think. That's a truism. So, okay, so then these would just be scored and slipped back on if I wanted to do that, okay? So the last thing I wanted to introduce for you to work with, and you know, really, here's another cool thing. While there's middle moisture, it's a good time to bring in capital punishment, okay? It's always a good day for capital punishment, especially in the world we're living in. But, you know, to make changes on this, it's not all about removing, it could also be about altering from paddling, we call it. So, what makes this possible is that there's enough moisture that it doesn't cause stress for cracking where it's becoming faceted. So you have to really, you know, catch it at the right moment for this. Oh, it's so satisfying though. Yeah, I love it. Okay. So you might want to play around with that. That's a middle dry thing usually. Okay, so one last thing is, I think I must have asked you to make something that you conceive of as a base to keep building up from, and this is one of the things that I made. So I want to talk about coil building. I know many of you have done this. If you've ever worked in clay, it's kind of almost like an intuitive thing. But there are some techniques to talk about. I'm sorry I'm leaving for a minute. Let me just grab this. Okay, now I'm back. So coil building is a way to slowly build up a hollow form from the ground up, okay? And in its slowness, you have lots of subtle changes that can be built in. And it is slow, usually. And it's much slower than many people. People have to get used to it. So in its, one of the reasons it's slow is because at some point, depending on the complexity of your shape and the scale of your shape, you may need to leave it alone so it can stiffen. And that can be really difficult because you've got something to do, right? You know, you want the clay to be on your schedule. I'm just going to get this done. So I always recommend, as you're part of your ceramic practice, work on multiple pieces at once. Because while something needs you to stop, something else will be there for you to do. You'll have a lot less Facebook check-ins, a lot less Instagram, whatever you do on there, but you'll have a very productive ceramic studio life, okay? So even when I'm building a practice, I might have two going at once. So there's drawing time while I'm doing this, and then now this is ready again, and it's like a bee pollinating flowers, okay? That's kind of how I think of it. Coiling. So I'm going to, there's so many ways to get to all of it. There's only, 40,000 years of people making things with coils, you know what I mean? It's a little overwhelming, but it's also very exciting. Because that's all accessible to you in many ways. So there's no wrong way, there's just consequences, okay? So please bear that in mind. What I'm going to do is point the ends, because in the continued controlled rolling of this into a certain diameter, The outside will be rolled more than the inside, making a well in the end that can trap air. This will compensate this point. It's going to be too much. So now that I've got it elongated, I'm going to work on my work table. I'm working on the canvas. Fingertips spread apart, gentle pressure down, and more pressure out to stretch it out. If I work it completely around each time, I don't get a flat tire. It'll keep rolling. How thick a coil do I make? One might be asking. Well, of course, there's infinite reasons why you would choose a coil thickness. In this case, I've somewhat determined what the coil thickness will be by the thickness of the base that I left. I would almost always start with a coil that's slightly thicker, so I have a place to pinch it thinner as I'm adding. That's one way to go about it. Many people start with really thin coils, and that it can lead to an exquisite object, because a thin wall communicates different content than a thick wall. And the vibration of these coils that are thin, it could be really, but the cost is 1 inch and drying time. 1 inch and drying time. The less material, the more unstable it's going to be, and it's going to need more rhythm away from touching. I'm not a big one for making work according to convenience. Sometimes the most inconvenient technique is the one you need because it expresses your idea the best. All right, so sometimes not. Sometimes you want to save time here so you can spend more time somewhere else. All of it's fine. Okay, so let me just get this here. So because this has been drying under plastic for a week and is leather hard, I'm going to score for the first coil attachment. Little slip. Now, why did I make the most unstable base? Because I wasn't really focused on it, that's why. Okay. So my first coil, I'm actually pushing down for compression to put strength in this seam. And I'm making a U connection around, so there's more shared surface. If I'm laying it on top and just relying on the slip, I have a real opportunity in the shrinkage for that to become a cracked seam. Now when I reach the beginning of the coil, I have a chance to make a change to the form that I'm building. If I place it on the outside of the previous coil, I'm taking the form out on a diagonal line from the center. If I place it on the inside, I'm closing it up. I can arch it in. So I'm kind of overlapping it and joining it. And now I'm going to close this side in while I'm opening the other side out. Okay, so that's a really rough, quick touch. When I get, usually with a couple of inches, I'll stop and I'll do more integration. I had a metal rib here. It's probably underneath here now. Don't you hate it when you lose your tools? They're right in front of you. So what I mean by that is I'm going to put more compressive strength between these individual coil units to make one compressed wall as I'm building. These can flex, so I could really, while I'm compressing, I could also be helping with the shape. Now I know many people that work with coils may want the evidence of the coil in the wall. You want to look like it was coil built, right? Yeah. No problem. But maybe you're compressing the inside and leaving more of the outside just to have the structure of that compression, the strength of it. Now, if this were ultimately going to be a 6-foot tall hollow form, this might be a little thin, a wall, but I would be compressing the hell out of all of it to support the weight of a bigger piece like that. If it's a teacup, you have a lot more leeway to leave it loose and like that. Of course, other things can be compressing coils as well. You could be leaving texture from a tool. While you're compressing. You know, you can take, maybe I'll just use this. You can make, oh, here's one. This is just fired clay, and it could be a stamp. So you could be inscribing in the soft wall that you're building these kind of symbolic language pieces of texture that you created that are in the language of what you're interested in. You know, this is a history of touching. It's not, it really is. It's layers of history of you showing up and having opportunities to leave a little bit more for the end when we, hopefully it's handled well, we see through all the layers to when the ball, almost the ball of clay you pulled that you began with. We can see all the layers in the object. And it's really, really magical when you do see a ceramic object like that. Okay, like that. So coil building is something your hands have to go through. Now, to have the, you know, I want you to go through this, whether you're interested in it or not. I want you to make some coil pieces. So one moment that's interesting in the development of a coil piece is when you want to make a dramatic change. It's heading out, and then you want it to head back in. That is usually a moment best served by drying. So that this dries before you change the direction. Otherwise, gravity will probably collapse it, right, with the weight. So if you know, to set them up knowing that you're going to reach a certain point and then leave it to stiffen and then come back and score and slip the next coil and change the direction. So I want you to do two things. I want you to take some of these parts that you were working on, and based on what you presented today, I want you to use some image from that presentation and create a sculpture by cutting and pasting these simple parts together. Just make it look like your piece somehow, your first ceramic piece. Use tools, make texture, add wet material to dry material, cut and paste the to dryer, deconstruct a part to get the right building block for what you're building. All of it's available. And in next class, we're going to have a little virtual wine and cheese reception for these pieces that you put together, and then I want to talk to the class. I mean, we're going to use the pieces you made to talk about the engineering, your choices, and how it might play out in the latter part of the process. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is I want you to begin envisioning a form that can be built from the ground up. It could be something that you know will just be one part that has to be cut and pasted together later. You might have to build all the parts separately for the moment they can come together into the more complicated structure. Okay? So just start the coiling. The other thing about the coiling is you just want to put your hands through the physicality of staying in control of your shape as you're building up. You know, whatever that means to you, whatever that control means to what you're doing. I want you to have that technical experience from this. All of it is, none of this is going to be at your retrospective at MoMA. Trust me, okay? No pressure. This is not a place to be precious. This is not a place to become attached. Even though I know you want to make beautiful things. I know this. I know. Just mine everything for information and do not be afraid to fail. That is the key. And especially these first days where you're just trying to sort out the physicality, the technique, the language of your work in ceramics, all of that. You're just really free of all of that pressure to make something beautiful. So don't put yourself through that. Next week, what will I do? Oh, color. Okay. And this, people, is not the color ceramics is famous for, which is glaze. That's coming soon, don't worry. This is essentially color that can be incorporated while you're still building form. It's color that can become structural. So now we have a formal physical way that the surface that we think holds a painting and the three-dimensional form of sculpture is a gray area available. So what you'll need is your brushes, if you don't already have them. I'm going to do a cooking show that talks about why you would bring color in early versus waiting and all the different stages around that. And then you're going to have some color to work with as early as next week that you can be working with in earlier stages. Okay, so, yay! Okay, end video, thank you.